It's already been an amazing 3 days here at the 2014 National Convention. I wouldn't think it could get any better, but we are not yet finished. I was thinking about that after Friday night, right here in this room, watching a wonderful conversation unfold. Justice Sotomayor, Ted Shaw, and like the national government, we got to hear it all without a warrant. I walked back to my room that night smiling. I am a bitter, grumpy, jaded old man. I don't smile a whole lot. And I woke up the next morning and I was still thinking about it. And one of the powerful things about watching something like that is it shows us that despite all of the struggles we face, the American dream, cliched as it may sound, is still alive. I mean, it was so good I thought, that's worth the price of admission even for the private sector folk. I got up the next morning and I thought, there's nothing that's going to top that. And I wandered into the Windsor luncheon. And amidst all that poignant, powerful conversation, to hear Pam Karlan say, calling Dr. Freud, I laughed so hard that I may have actually urinated a little bit. I told everyone at the table that it was iced tea, but here's the thing, I don't care what it was. It changed my life. That woman is obviously profound, intelligent, but that's up there with some of the greatest lines ever. And the thing about it is it actually had some import for me as a lawyer, because now, for the first time in my career as an attorney, when I hear Justice Scalia, I actually smile. And you know that I am smiling because I'm picturing him on top of a flagpole. I can't help that. I am part of the gay agenda, and that counts as CLE, C. Lawrence, paren, Scalia, comma, J, period, comma, dissenting, and paren, period. But despite that, here we are 3 days later, and we have yet more great speakers, and I promise you that the one I'm about to introduce is going to be an act that can follow them. Here's the thing about everything that happened between these speakers, though. Every one of the panels, as good as they were, points out to you how many rights in America are still under attack today. And as much as I respect the Supreme Court and appreciate rulings, you have to remember that we can't rely on them to save us or our rights. Next week will be 2 years after Sebelius. Despite the fact that both Congress and the court have spoken, here we are this much later with sick children and men and women suffering, trying to access meaningful health care. And every one of those panels represents some other right that is at issue here. It's as if America has lost its way in a very profound way. When is it that rights were seen as wrongs by our citizens and our elected officials and our judges? That is completely antithetical to the way I was raised, which was not in a family of privilege. It was in a family of immigrants that, like Justice Sotomayor, didn't forget where they came from. My mother's family was Irish and German. The Irish made their way to New York and then got smart and went up to Boston. Go Sox. But the Germans were asked to leave because they were pacifist. And as you know from history, pacifism is decidedly not a German trait. So they made their way to Cincinnati, where there was a community that would accept them and educate them and give them jobs. And after a few years there, they made their way upriver. This would have been my mother's great-grandfather. And they settled in a small little town called Portsmouth in a poor little county called Scioto that you probably never heard of before and will never hear about again. And when I say that it's poor, I mean that only in a financial way, because it's one of the most beautiful areas of the country, or at least it was, nestled in the foothills that become the Appalachian Mountains, bordered by the Ohio River. You look out across it and you see the hills of Kentucky. But that land has been strip mined and fracked over, And one of the greatest resources there is being depleted even as I'm speaking right now. But the people that are from there take great pride in being an American, and they do that in a good way. I was taught that the Constitution is the soul of this nation, not in some religious divine way, but it's what breathed life into what this country is and what makes us matter, because we do live in a democracy where we are given rights and that we should be thankful for them every day. I moved from Hawaii as a child to that same small southern county in Ohio. I remember looking for palm trees and finding none. And I learned for the very first time about that age what an attorney was, because in my mother's family's households, there were always two trinities, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, and John, Bobby, and Martin. The fact that Bobby Kennedy was an attorney was completely lost on me because I couldn't understand why in the world would you need an attorney to give you a right that you already had. I mean, I believed everything that he was doing to help Dr. King, but it just seemed such a foreign concept. But of course, I grew up, more or less. I know that's hard to believe at this moment. But as an adolescent, it started to resonate very profoundly for me in a different way. As somebody who had taken great pride in living in Ohio, I grew up with leaders like Howard Metzenbaum and John Glenn. They were men that didn't forget where they came from either. They contributed to the state and to the country. But by the time I graduated from one of Ohio's great public schools in 1986, which had prepared me enough to be admitted to good graduate programs in Boston, I ran like hell. 1986, you heard about Bowers v. Hardwick. You know what it was like. As a gay man, I felt no more than 3/5 of a citizen in Ohio. Around that time, Wisconsin passed the first LGBT civil rights law in the country. I thought about moving there, but I thought, that's just like Ohio, but colder and better cheese. And Massachusetts was starting to talk about it. And so off I went to the land of Kennedys, to the land where Dr. King studied. And I remember when I got there, I made my mother promise that if I died, she could not bury one of my ashes in the state of Ohio. And I was serious. She always brings that up to me when I'm sitting at her dinner table alive. You know how mothers can be. I love her dearly. But the thing about Massachusetts was not that it was perfect, but I knew what it was like to be a great citizen. I knew what it was like to vote in an election where your candidate actually won. I knew it was like to have a law school like Northeastern, where Mary Bonato went, one of my first heroines in the law. Back in those days, we considered it the gay Harvard. It was where you went if you wanted to do AIDS work or gay work in a positive way. Obviously, we weren't that smart, or we would have called it gay Yale. But from there, I went on to be very fortunate, personally, professionally, politically. And it was a very difficult decision to leave a land that I had adopted and come back to Ohio, but that was for family reasons. I bought my house in Columbus in April of 2004. About 6 months later, there was a little election. Presidentially, Ohio went red, something that I hadn't remembered Massachusetts ever doing. And the same rights that I gained in Massachusetts were stripped from me in an amendment to a constitution that told me my husband was no longer my husband. And that was not a close vote like the presidential election. It was 2-1. I've been with my husband for 22 years, and many, many times I have thought about killing and divorcing him. But I have never once done it. Please erase that. That sounds like prior calculation and design. If he has I swear it wasn't me. But my point is that I've married him 3 times, and it was never an issue in Massachusetts. But when I started my job at the Ohio Supreme Court, the HR officer handed me back my enrollment forms for health insurance and told me I could not check married. I did not have a spouse. We eventually agreed to compromise, and I would put yes, asterisk, and at the bottom it said, legally in Massachusetts, comma, not recognized in Ohio. First time I've ever been happy for a public records request. But with that said, when I came back, I knew I was doing the right thing for my family, even though I thought it was a huge, colossal mistake for me. And I've made a lot of big mistakes in my life. But in the next couple of years, 3 things happened that saved me. Now, I want you to know, I became a citizen there on Groundhog Day 2005. That's exactly 9 years, 4 months, and 19 days ago. Not that I've counted every one. I was worried. But I discovered Jenny's Splendid ice creams. If you haven't, you certainly should. It's addictive and you won't care. Secondly, ACS started a chapter in Columbus. Men like Dan Roth and Mike Muty, who now run chapters elsewhere, and Sarah Knight and Jill Dash made sure that that happened. That was personally important to me. It was a lifeline to progressive thought. But it's also done a lot to change the discourse in Columbus. And by discourse, I mean loud, strong arguments. But the third thing that happened to me was that Governor Ted Strickland was elected that year. And that was as important because he won in the same 2-to-1 margin that my rights had been stripped with. And even though I was in Massachusetts, I knew who the now governor, then Congressman Strickland was. Because like so many of our other speakers, he didn't forget where he came from either when he got to this beautiful city. He comes from that same part of Scioto County that my family immigrated to. It's poor. When you wonder why so much money goes into roadways, if you have a question, come down there and visit. It literally is a lifeline for people. He made sure that there were efforts to bring the internet there, not so that all of you could get on your smartphones or post from Facebook while you were there. He did that so that students could improve their education. We have lots of property poor schools there in a system that was declared unconstitutional by the Ohio Supreme Court 4 times. Governor Strickland was the first person who tried to bring meaningful educational reform to over 600 public school systems in Ohio. And he didn't stop there. He went on to the universities and colleges. There are over 220 of them there. Many of them are state institutions, and they're quality, and that's by no accident, it's design. Because education is your ticket to empowerment, as every person in this room knows. And he made sure that no matter how poor those children may be, or how middle class, that they could access a meaningful education right there in Ohio. While he was governor, he managed to do things that conservatives like to take credit for. He turned Ohio, in the midst of the Great Recession, into a place that was attractive, particularly for small businesses. By the time he left office, Ohio was considered an optimistic place to start and maintain a business. And there were very few people that could say that. But he was smart and sensible and pragmatic. It didn't mean end all regulation. It meant end all unnecessary regulation. And in that process, he didn't trade off the environment or the poor or those with less than rights. In fact, he did the exact opposite. Under Governor Strickland, our waters and our air and our soil was cleaner. And that has not been preserved. I just read this week on my work email that the Ohio River, one of the biggest in the nation, a historical part of our expansion, is now considered one of the most polluted places. Remember, I'm from Ohio. We had a river that burned once. You don't tend to forget things like that. But here we are in 2014, watching a major tributary to the Mississippi that dumps into the Gulf that's had enough trouble get more and more polluted by big corporations, and nobody seems to give a damn. It's not that those things are antithetical to business. It just takes a true leader to be able to balance them. Both in Congress and as a leader in our state, he made sure that children didn't just have education, but they had meals that went with it. And he made sure that they had access to health care. And he continues to fight for those very same things today. Even though he was immensely popular and a man of great integrity when he was our governor, in a very bitter, long, drawn-out battle, he narrowly lost to some guy from Wall Street who couldn't get 50% of the vote. Now, I have to say about that gentleman that I had him wrong in some ways. I thought for sure he'd never believe in any rights. He does. They're just for corporations. Governor Strickland remembered that individuals also include humans. But even after that very bitter defeat, he showed more class than any of us. While we cried and were angry and drunk and dysfunctional, he stepped up and he went to his successor and offered his help. Whether it was with the economy or in the environment or the death penalty, one of the most intense things that happens in Ohio. And he was sincere in every part of that. But afterwards, when the new administration wanted to do something that was under this seemingly innocuous title, Senate Bill 5, which would have stripped every public school teacher, police officer, firefighter, and state worker of almost any collective bargaining rights, he stood up and helped lead that charge against it. And it lost by a 2-to-1 margin. That takes courage, it takes resiliency, it takes a lot of strength. And he continues to do so. Even after he lost, he made sure that Ohio went blue again. Even then, he didn't end work for all kinds of elected officials, all kinds of progressive organizations. But we in Ohio have a tendency to export our best products. I know some of you from San Francisco may disagree, but here's the truth. We gave you Dean Martin, Chrissie Hynde and the Pretenders, all of rock and roll, Jenny's, which evidently you know about, LeBron James, and Governor Ted Strickland, who is now here at the Center for American Progress Action Committee. He is somebody who quite possibly may have saved my life. He's someone that makes me proud, just like Justice Sotomayor, to be an attorney and to be an Ohioan and to be an American. Please help me in welcoming him here to speak to you now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Two other people came from where I came from, Scioto County, a road called Duck Run. How many of you have heard of Roy Rogers, the king of the Cowboys? He came from about a quarter of a mile from where I grew up. And about 3 miles down the road on Duck Run was where Branch Rickey grew up, the man who integrated Major League Baseball. So I'm proud of my home and my road. And I'm proud to have been invited to speak to you today. Thank you for that. It's a real honor. As I looked over the agenda for this conference and looked at the many speakers you've had, I thought to myself, well, I almost did what he said he did in his pants. I was so intimidated by this gathering, but thank you. Now, thinking about what I could say that would be of added value to this meeting, I concluded that perhaps some of my experiences as a former minister, a psychologist who worked in a maximum security prison for more than 10 years, a 6-term congressman, and the former governor of the state of Ohio, that these experiences may enable me to share with you some personal thoughts and opinions and experiences that would illustrate why the work of the ACS is so critically important. Let me begin by saying that I believe we are engaged in a continuous struggle, a political and ideological struggle to protect and to maintain the freedoms which were guaranteed to us in the Constitution. And that's why your organization is so important. Without question, those of us who are progressives have been outmaneuvered by the conservatives. They formed the Federalist Society, and they went to work to see that their members were strategically placed in positions of importance and influence, and ultimately to be placed on the Supreme Court. They planned and successfully carried out a redistricting agenda that gives them huge electoral advantages. They, through their conservative and libertarian think tanks, and specifically through the work of ALEC, have established outposts in nearly every state to work on enacting their agenda in the state capitals. Now, the struggle we are experiencing today is not a new one. It has been a part of our country's development from the very beginning. However, it is more intense today because of the explosion of conservative media and the infusion of unlimited amounts of money. In spite of these facts, I believe that when we consider the long-term health of our democracy, we have reason to be hopeful for the future. We are becoming more diverse. We are becoming more inclusive. We are becoming more tolerant and accepting of differences. And we should celebrate these changes. But these changes bring with them short-term danger and threat to our nation. Now, why would I say that? Well, let's consider what's happening here in Washington and in state capitals across the nation. Political dysfunction and gridlock. And where legislative changes are occurring, my friends, it often involves efforts to suppress the vote, to deny workers the right to organize, to limit a woman's right to choose, and other efforts to limit individual freedoms. I believe this is happening because the conservative wing of the Republican Party and the radical Tea Party elements within that party see the demographic changes that are happening, and they are so threatened by the inevitable results of those changes that they are now willing to engage in extreme behaviors in a desperate attempt to hold on to power and to hold on to their view of what America has been and should continue to be. Now, unfortunately, an unholy alliance between social conservatives, religious fundamentalists, and economic libertarians has, in my judgment, pretty much emasculated the moderates within the Republican Party. And the results are evident, are they not? I recall a conversation I had at an Ohio State football game with the newly elected speaker, John Boehner. And John came up, and as we were chatting, he said to me these words, and I won't forget them. He said to me, "Ted, I can't control these people," speaking about the newly elected Tea Party members of Congress. "I can't control these people," he said, "so I'm just going to turn them loose and see what happens." Well, we've seen what happens. Government shutdown, failure to deal with immigration, investigative committee witch hunts, failure to address economic concerns, and overall general dysfunction. And all of this, my friends, has been exacerbated by the Supreme Court's declaration that money is speech and that corporations are people. Now, the truth be told, all of us bring to we bring with us our own set of opinions, values, biases, beliefs to the decisions we make. That is certainly true of legislators who pass laws, the executives who administer those laws, and the judges who determine the constitutionality of those laws. You know, not every law is a good law, and terrible things have been done in this country in the name of law and order. And that is why I believe of the three branches of government, the judicial branch has the greatest power to do good or to do harm to individuals and to the country. I'd like to share some conclusions I have reached as a result of my experiences as a legislator and as a governor. I strongly believe that the administration of justice should be a public function. And that's why, as a congressman, I introduced legislation to prevent the privatization of our federal prisons. State prisons are being privatized across our country. I believe that incarceration as punishment is a part of the administration of justice and should not be turned over to a for-profit corporation whose primary responsibility is to increase the value for shareholders. This I believe, has led to the inappropriate levels of incarceration that we've seen in this country. I further believe that judges should not be elected, but should be appointed with safeguards in place to see that those who are selected meet appropriate standards. In my state and in many states, our judges are elected. And huge sums of money from special interest groups pour into those contests, and the results are predictable. But I also believe that prosecutors should be elected and should be appointed as well. And I have a special angst when it comes to this particular issue. Prosecutors have incredible power to do great good or to do great harm. Let me say that prosecutors are some of my best friends, literally. But, my friends, unlike most other elected officials, prosecutors are not subjected to the same level of accountability. Prosecutors can decide what charges to bring and under what circumstances. They can exercise undue influence over the decisions coming out of a grand jury. They can abuse the use of the plea bargain by overcharging a defendant and using those overcharges as a threat. And based on my experience as governor, they can sometimes make getting and maintaining a conviction the goal, rather than the ultimate goal being the pursuit of justice. While I was governor, and Richard Cordray, who's now over the Consumer Protection Bureau, Richard was Attorney General in Ohio, and I was governor. The Columbus Dispatch did a series of articles on incarcerated individuals who had always maintained their innocence, and where there was DNA evidence that had never been examined. And so the Innocence Project said that they would, in fact, pay for any testing of these materials. And so Richard Cordray, as Attorney General, and I, as Governor, wrote letters, a joint letter, to these county elected prosecutors, just simply asking them to make the material available for testing. To my knowledge, not a one of them responded in the affirmative. Some did not respond at all, and others responded with hostile, angry letters, basically saying, "Mind your own business." Why would a prosecutor object to having evidence examined at no cost to them or to their county? It's very disturbing. Terribly disturbing. Ultimately, some of those individuals were released. Another experience while I was governor, we passed a law regarding the collection of evidence, the storage of evidence. We included in that law requirements for how lineups were to be conducted, saying that the person conducting the lineup should not be aware of which individual in the lineup was the suspect, and a number of other provisions. And I signed that law in our cabinet room, and of course there were members of the press there and other interested parties, but there were two African American gentlemen there. One had spent more than 25 years in prison as a result of eyewitness testimony for a rape that he did not commit, and who was freed as a result of DNA evidence. And a second gentleman spent nearly 20 years. And as we were concluding the ceremony, the signing ceremony, the gentleman who had been in prison for more than 25 years raised his hand, and he said, "Governor, don't you remember me?" And I said, "Where did I meet you?" And he said, "You were my psychologist when I was in the prison." And I took that gentleman into the governor's office and put him in the governor's chair and stood behind him, and we got our picture taken. And I said to him, 16 years ago when we were both in prison, neither one of us knew that we would be in the governor's office today. But my friends, you can't give back 25 years. Our criminal justice system is perhaps the best there is, but it is not perfect. And that's why we need those who administer that system of justice to be sensitive to the flaws that exist in that system and willing to introspect and to question themselves and to do everything possible to know that justice has been achieved. Now, I'm going to close by talking about Bush v. Gore, and you've heard a lot about Bush v. Gore. And I wasn't going to mention Bush v. Gore, but I was watching TV last night, and I saw Ted Olson and David Boyce being interviewed together. And they're working, as you know, to establish the right of individuals in our country to marry whoever they choose to marry. And I applaud them for that. And they obviously have become personal friends as well as cohorts in this effort to bring about marriage equality. But near the end of that interview, Bush v. Gore was raised. And I listened to these two individuals talk about that incredible episode in our nation's history, which I refer to, I'm not an attorney, so I can do this, I guess. I refer to it as a legal coup. At the time, I was so proud of Al Gore for doing what I thought at the time, and I'm sure he thought was in the best interest of this country, by graciously accepting the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States of America and sparing the country the agony and the angst of more conflict. Reflecting back on that, over the years, I have concluded that perhaps we should have gone to the streets, not to overturn the decision. That was a final decision. That was a final decision. But simply to put a marker in the history books that as a people we understood what had happened, and perhaps make sure that it would never happen again. But I conclude my remarks by sharing with you the response of Ted Olson and the response of David Boyce. When questioned about the outcome of that decision, they went through their reasoning. And at the end, Ted Olson concluded by saying that to impugn the motives of the justices does great damage to the court and to our system of justice. And then they turned to David Boyce for a response, and among other things, he concluded his statement by saying, there were 3 justices who did what they thought was in the best interest of the country, and they thought it was in the country's best interest to have George Bush to be the president. Your society is so critically important. And I hope you understand the value that you bring to our national debate and to the promotion of freedom and democracy and the protection of individual rights by what you do. Thank you so very much for letting me come and talk with you.